CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy. After 2 years and more than 80 episodes of our Conversations on African Philanthropy, we are introducing a series of conversations that are theme-specific, program-focused, and at times recorded at the request of those at the coalface of implementation in order to document and tell their experiences and stories. In the first of such series, we focus on the Zimbabwe Alliance Initiative, whose grants, convenings, capacity building, and technical support have fostered a vibrant civil society, where partners were empowered to design innovative and coordinated responses that amplify the voices of those marginalized, influence the capacity of citizens to mobilize around national critical issues, engage with policymakers, and built regional and international solidarity in pursuit of a better Zimbabwe. Formed in 2010 to strengthen the role of civil society in influencing Zimbabwe's transition to democracy, the Alliance has evolved over several phases to what it is today. An initiative of several partners, Zimbabwe Alliance is a story of resilience, innovation, dedication, and passion expressed somewhat beautifully in some of the least expected places and ways.
Welcome to our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Prof Moyo. This is a very good and special segment to the work that we do. In a couple of videos and a couple of episodes, we'll be focusing on an initiative that started way back in the early 2000s, around 2008, 2009, focusing on strengthening civil society formations in Zimbabwe, in a country that was going through a transition. The initiative is called the Zimbabwe Alliance. I'm very excited to be joined this morning by Takudzwa Ngadziore, a member of parliament in Zimbabwe, the chairperson of the youth caucus, and former ZINASU president from the year 2020 to 2022. Takudzwa, welcome to the Conversations.
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming.
Thank you so much. As you heard in the background, this is a special conversation that we are having with a lot of activists, a lot of actors, civil society formations, but also some of the developmental partners that have been part of this journey of the Zimbabwe Alliance, an initiative that came about to strengthen civil society formations in Zimbabwe. Our understanding is that you have been one of the people that have been involved throughout the journey in several ways. So maybe let's start with the first part of your engagement with the initiative with Trust Africa when you were with ZINASU. Maybe you can tell us a bit about what ZINASU does, what it stands for, but also the kind of work that ZINASU has been working on. And during your time, you could maybe pull out some of those issues that could link back to this notion of strengthening civil society in Zimbabwe, given the context that most formations like ZINASU and others are operating in.
Thank you so much. So the Zimbabwe National Students Union, in brackets ZINASU, is a students' movement with a vision to create an inclusive and democratic Zimbabwe with students as integral stakeholders, where student concerns are heard and academic freedoms are upheld and promoted. Particularly, my role in the Zimbabwe National Students Union started from when I was chairperson, but then moved to become a student representative council president. Later on, also becoming the president of the entire institution from the year 2020 to 2022. The particular focus was around academic freedoms, but also importantly, our response in the dynamics that were happening in the national and broader societal issues that were also happening. So it works with tertiary institutions. These are to include the polytechnic colleges, the teachers' colleges, and the universities. And it has been affiliated to around 46 institutions within the country. So being the Zimbabwe National Students Union president meant I was supposed to lead the National Executive Council, a NEC which had 9 members, and these members particularly had different focuses in terms of leadership and execution. So, being the president, mine was to make sure that they deliver, but importantly, to convene the general council meetings, to respond to issues that were happening, and just to guide the vision and make sure that it also gets to be fulfilled. So, being part of with that vision and being part of Trust Africa, this meant that we were coming through to a platform where we were bringing in a student's voice, but importantly, representing the genuine concerns of members of the academia. So myself as president, we used to be having these meetings and engagements with Trust Africa to engage in terms of, number one, guiding the perspective that they had on particularly student issues. You know that Section 75 of the Zimbabwean Constitution enshrines within it that Zimbabwean education should be accessible and affordable. So with us being from the Zimbabwe National Students Union, we used to advocate on the forefront to make sure that we engage in informed issue-based advocacy. One, we also engage in strategic radicalism. Two, using Section 59, where we could peacefully petition or demonstrate to raise our issues and to register our discontent. So using those methods in the struggle for academic freedom to thrive, we would see Trust Africa as a platform in which we could attain solidarity. And the ZimAlliance project particularly, which had members from the informal sector of Zimbabwe, the formal sector of Zimbabwe, coming through to raise through a voice. So this was a platform in which our voices, students, could be amplified, but also could be heard, importantly, before being amplified, because we always felt like there were no institutions that could listen to our concerns and that could guide what we were doing then. So that was more of the relationship that we had with the ZimAlliance, particularly as a pillar in the struggle, as a solidarity platform, and also as an avenue where our voice could be heard.
Yeah. So, like I said, this initiative was established at the time when the country was going through something that was called the Government of National Unity.
Yes.
And civil society formations were also expected to play huge roles. Maybe let's contextualize the role of students in that period, and of course link it back to some of the issues you are talking about in terms of how Trust Africa had pillars around some of the work around the informal sector, the artists,
Yes.
and others. And so let's just see how we can contextualize the role of students in that particular moment and in that regard.
Thank you very much. I think you aptly put it when you mention how politics evolves around the two concepts of peace and conflict. And the birth of the ZimAlliance program came through when Zimbabwe was in a political and also economic crisis. But to get to the history of the students' movement, you will realize that the Zimbabwe National Students Union, or particularly the students' movement, has been a critical pillar to determine where Zimbabwe should focus. And it has been a platform where other voices could unite. So you look through to the formation of the opposition political party, the movement itself. The students were a critical voice. But this is not only a dynamic that you see in Zimbabwe only. You would realize that in many nations, students have been a voice to lead, to change, to execute revolutions that are people-driven because of how, number one, we are centered in society, and we can easily unite society regardless of how it is stratified. If you are to see the workers' movements, these are our parents and our guardians from the student sector. If you are to see the vendors, these remain also a critical force of people in which they can fund what we are doing at school, what we are doing at tertiary institutions, and also with that relationship alone, we will then realize that students are at the center of uniting society, regardless of how it might be stratified. So from that period when Zimbabwe had gone through those shifts, I would submit that the Zimbabwe National Students Union was providing a genuine voice and concerns that we need to rise up as young people to reaffirm our collective power contumaciously to respond to issues within the national discourse. So this meant that as the students' movement, we needed to go beyond talking about institutional politics at the University of Zimbabwe, at Great Zimbabwe University, at Masvingo Teachers College, at any polytechnic that you would think of. But to also say we are at the risk of a shambolic state of economy, we're at the risk of failing to pay for the fees or failing to access the institutions, because if you are to look at it, when this program was launched, we had fuel crisis, there were queues for basic commodities, and we have students who should not be viewed in the essence of being objects, but are still human beings who need to acquire, these basic commodities. So in my submission, I would say that before students are students, they are citizens. So having the ZimAlliance as a platform to reshape the narrative in that platform, we would have a platform in which we can target citizen-centered issues and in which we could air our voice and concerns and be a determining factor. In politics, during the days of the students' movement, we used to say the duty of a thermometer is to measure temperature, but of a thermostat is to determine temperature. So we used to say the students' movement is a political thermostat in a particular or a given politic. So it was to submit that the students' movement guides and determines the temperature of the political landscape or terrain in any given country. And particularly Zimbabwe is no exception. If you are to look in the 1960s, 80s, South Africa, we have the Soweto uprising. In the 1999s with Iran, if you are to look at the role of the students, particularly focusing on the streets of Ferguson, 2013, the Black Lives Matter. If you are to look at currently what has been happening in other nations, students have been at the center of redefining, stating, and also defining the narrative, particularly in the national discourse. And this is what ZimAlliance provided for us. And playing that duty with myself being president and leader of the students' movement, I think we successfully managed to air our concerns and register our discontent to all those dynamics that we're evolving.
Yeah. So we'll continually be weaving in some of those elements into the conversation, especially your time as the president of ZINASU. But you were also somebody who was part and parcel of the team.
Yes.
At Trust Africa. You were here at Trust Africa as an intern, and then you also went up to become a program associate. In particular, I'm understanding that you were responsible for the organization and putting together of the events around the Citizens Manifesto.
Yes.
So maybe we can talk about your time, firstly here, how you got to be associated with
Yes.
Trust Africa and the ZimAlliance project, and then we can talk about the birth of the Citizens Manifesto. And I want to preface this by saying, the objectives of the ZimAlliance in the beginning when it was set up, it was strictly to provide support to civil society in all their formations during that transition period. But it was also to help donors pull their resources together in a collective manner. But over time, you would agree with me that those objectives might have remained the same, but the approaches have shifted,
Yes.
which is why the Citizens Manifesto, as well as what we currently have now, the Baraza,
Yes.
are completely different from the initial arrangements, which is understandable in
Yeah.
any context where you have to keep on changing tactics and strategies.
Yes.
But I want us to first hear about you as a person associated with Trust Africa and the ZimAlliance, and how you then got to be involved in the Citizen Manifesto, and what you see as some of those shifts and some of those successes when you were here.
So I think to answer the first part of the question, yes, I did affiliate myself with Trust Africa as an intern, a person who was studying politics and public administration, and I felt like Trust Africa provided a like-minded institution for me to pursue my academic career and also just to learn more from the work related learning. So during those moments, I remember particularly well, we would be at the center of driving not only the thought processes, but curating programs that would engage with members of civil society in Zimbabwe, but importantly, engage with critical individuals who would come through to our programs and also just to participate in a variety of activities. So I remember my first task with Vivid Gwede was to write a research around illicit financial flows. So this was also a moment in which I had to perfect my writing skills and also learn more about using research as a tool to influence work being done at a programming scale. So I think that was really a critical moment in which I would be at the center of coming through for meetings and reporting and also just monitoring the work that we have been doing through. So that was during the internship period with me being at Trust Africa. But importantly, I think the second part of your question raises a very important dynamic where you mention how ZimAlliance came through with then programs like Citizens Manifesto, which I participated in also as an associate doing programming. I think that Citizen Manifesto, number one, successfully amplified the different voices and diverse voices of society. We had people from the Vendors Initiative, we had people from the teachers' side with the Amalgamated Rural Teachers Union, we had students from the Zimbabwe National Students Union, we had institutions like SimCode who were focusing on debt and development. We had a variety of institutions who would come through, but the main agenda would be to listen to everyone's concern and give it value by being a backing power and force to amplify that particular voice. But importantly, with ZimAlliance being a pillar to provide support, I think there is an interesting dynamic which came through during the course of this support. And it was around the aspect of envisioning community is the answer. So, from you looking at resource in terms of the monetary aspect, you are now telling people that there is a resource within yourselves when you are to give each other solidarity, when you are to unite and ask yourselves the critical questions that are affecting you from dusk to dawn, when you are going through issues and you need to be on your own, organize to make sure that you respond to this. So I think an example I would give is when the mine in Bindura collapsed and we were part of the Citizens Manifesto. We went there with limited amounts of resource, but what we did was to make sure that we make people realize that there is a sense of power when you are to unite all that little that you have, when you are to redistribute your focus areas. So one is maybe chopping firewood, the other one is, focusing on receiving some visitors. Now it was not being done in silos. We made sure that we break those barriers that people would have during a critical moment in which they wanted to be consoled. We managed to establish critical synergies that would unite and make people realize the power of humanity, just to have humanity as a resource, moving away from the monetary support that you issue to people or maybe civil society, but to say we are going to stand side to side within each other and for each other. So I think that critical dynamic in which there was a move in realizing that ZimAlliance was only there to provide the support. But I think that dynamic for ZimAlliance to be a critical cog to get people realize quickly how within themselves there is a certain power in which they can achieve and attain all their aspirations and all that they may need. So I think I feel that was a really, really important dynamic.
So, as somebody who came from, obviously, from outside with already some experience in student politics, you come into this initiative, we are now assisting it in terms of shaping its objectives, but also its implementation. What would you say, after your association with it and what you have seen after you have left, what would you say have been some of the key successful moments and some of the challenging moments that maybe if we were to rethink the intervention, we could do it differently?
I think the key and interesting moments would have been the dynamism in terms of implementing the programming work. You know particularly well that there has been the National Citizen Convention as part of a programming area that would happen annually, but just to unite voices, to engage beyond the local, but to engage even regionally and globally, engage the moment at a democratic scale. And I think that has been done particularly in a variety of ways. So that being a convention that comes through, we've also had the Let Art Speak campaign, which would use art as a voice of expression, going beyond art as entertainment, but as edutainment, going beyond art as what people express towards themselves, but to express what community is also feeling. I think that was a very critical dynamic in terms of programming, and also just to come through with a creative and disruptive momentum in which artists in Zimbabwe, particularly if you are to listen to many of their songs, then they would focus on how they are contributing to maybe their personal experiences, how they see the world and stuff, but engaging the mind of the populace and communicating to it. I think from an academic point of view, that is an interesting dynamic. But importantly, having a citizens manifesto to reshape the narrative at a level of echoing the concrete realities and genuine concerns, be it of the young people and the elderly. So from an intergenerational perspective, you would see that the ZimAlliance project managed to come in through with that aspect of challenging through at a level of opportunities. But to the last part of your question, which speaks about the challenges, I would submit that these challenges were more contextually based with the political terrain that we have been having. Voices that represent the genuine concerns of the people who have always been victims of labeling, have always been affected at a political scale, to be thought that they are not only voices of dissent, but voices of regime change. They are not only voices of concern and grievances, but they are voices to that align, particularly in some other narratives, puppets of the West. Such sorts of labeling come through when people express themselves. And I submit that the contextual framework, particularly with how hard we have been having, a repression and oppression at a political scale, it was quite hard for ZimAlliance to continuously have meetings, and that was a challenge. But importantly, away from the political factors and repression that I've mentioned, you also need to look at the natural disorders that were happening through. A global pandemic came through around 2020, 2021, 2022. So that pandemic alone meant people had to reimagine how they work, how they interact, and how you continuously raise the same voice of the people and the masses that you were raising through. And we now needed to engage in, virtual advocacy. We now needed to engage in many ways of making sure that we utilize the social distancing, the guidelines from the World Health Organizations, but still register our voice in that particular terrain. I think from an opportunity level, yes, that was a challenge, but there were now opportunities that were brought forward, particularly because now people would say COVID-19 is here to stay. And let's imagine ourselves living with it. How can we then make sure that our institutions are going to function, are going to respond to the work that they are supposed to be doing to guide the vision, particularly of Trust Africa within its three main focuses around democratic governance, African philanthropy, and equitable development. I think those, particularly to me, would be the main challenges to highlight.
Yeah. So I want us to move to the next segment, but before I do that, we are lucky in that what you are describing at that time, we are lucky in that we are also joined by Tendai here, who used to be the executive director. And I don't know, he might have some questions to ask, but while he's preparing, I want you to talk to us about how the students' movement was involved in the Citizens Manifesto, because I want us to weave in that thread as well. And then after that, we'll go to Tendai to see if he's got questions around, because you mentioned a lot of things, including writing papers on illicit financial flows and all of that.
So I think to answer that question, the students' movement was very much involved in the Citizens Manifesto. I've said that the Citizens Manifesto was a platform in which the voice, not actually the voice of citizens was amplified. But for the voice to be amplified, we had to make sure that we have diverse voices coming through to the platform. And the students' movement would echo its concerns, its solutions that would come through. I remember very well during the times of the pandemic, we had our own view of how we needed to rescue the academic year, but we had to use the ZimAlliance as a platform, as a students' movement. So particularly what we did was to write a statement, which we sent through to the ZimAlliance team, the Citizens Manifesto team, to say we believe that during this time when we need to rescue the academic year, we need to strengthen virtually how people are interacting with the educational aspects. We need to provide for gadgets. The government needs to increase the funding, particularly to those who are in the rural aspects. Number one, we need an affordable bundle, data bundle, in which people can access education easier. And I remember, even up until now, there's an e-learning bundle that was provided by Econet and Liquid Zone, free Wi-Fi's were introducing, particularly the institutions and stuff. And we also advocated that the ac.zw domains be accessible at zero rate. So you know very well that institutions have their own websites. But we were saying the institutions can put through a library that can be accessible with students going online to access the e-resources, the books, the research documents, the past examination papers that they would want through. So we were thinking through from a solution-based advocacy as a students' movement. But for us to be heard, we needed to have a particular vehicle that would say, can you please listen to this? And ZimAlliance, particularly the Citizens Manifesto, was a platform in which we could register those solutions, particularly look at the Amalgamated Rural Teachers Union. The Zimbabwe National Students Union at that particular time is saying we need to have our teachers, even those who are part of, who are educating us, being taught how to use some of these gadgets. It was part of the solutions that we thought. And this was just a synergy between what we were advocating for and what the Amalgamated Rural Teachers Union were advocating for. We were saying we need support in terms of grants that would enable people to pay for education. This was the same concern that people who were into vending, living in a hand-to-mouth economic setup, were also advocating for, because they could now no longer send people to schools. And we're saying at least tuition should be reduced so that people can afford education at that particular time. So if you are to look at the setup of the Citizens Manifesto and our voice coming through to this platform, you will realize there were much contributions that we would put through as the Zimbabwe National Students Union. But importantly, it was also to reshare that same voice that would come through from ZimAlliance, because we would understand that students are not only consumers of content, but they're also producers of it. So we would make sure that we share whatever knowledge that we have, whatever voices that was coming through from these institutions. We're also sharing it to our colleagues, to various platforms on WhatsApp, Facebook, YouTube, just to make sure that people don't feel like there is no voice out there. So I feel like those were critical moments in which the students' movement was participating in the Citizens Manifesto at a thought level, but also at an organizing level, from when the social fabric had been tattered, but to where we were going through to re-establish and reaffirm that collective power.
Yeah. So maybe let's just get some input from Tendai.
So thanks so much, Takudzwa. The question is, students come and go. cohorts of students come and go, what will be your sort of your lasting impression of your term leading ZINASU, and what do you think is sort of could be your legacy or stuff that which you say we set this up and it's still going on right now? How sustainable has been students' politics from the time you took over to where we are now?
Thank you so much for that critical question. You mentioned the reality that students come and go, but importantly, it's a question I would return with to go where. So, from an advocacy perspective, we would submit that students are workers in transit. But from the context, you understand how around 70.4% of our population is unemployed, misemployed, um, or employed and yet earning less than $2 per daily per capita. But my submission, particularly to the question you ask, is around how we sustain the student's voice, even in the midst of us knowing that this is a platform where we are only in transit. The first thing I think would be ideological orientation and clarity. I've made sure during the time in which I was a student's president that we need to be centered to the pro-left in which we voice the concerns of the marginalized, of the poor, of those without. And from that standpoint, you realize that the deficiencies that come through when you have a hard-hitting economy, or even when it's stable, when you have ideological orientation and clarity, you can seed and have cadres who are more informed than members who come just only to affiliate. I also made sure that we revive our communication strategies. This was in a way to engage with how we now live in an era with disruptive technologies, the fourth industrial revolution being underway, the 21st century that we live in. We had to be having those websites, we had to have those WhatsApp groups, we had to be engaging on Facebook Live, videos. I understand particularly well that we had a Facebook series that was going through during the COVID-19 period to engage with the people throughout. But I think that is a legacy of reviving communication channels to meet the dictates of the 21st century is a legacy on its own, because society now looks at how you can unpack your issues, but importantly, how you are using the modern ways of doing it. So the modernization of those communication channels was really a key narrative. But I also think that as a legacy, as the leader of the students movement, then I introduced a culture to engage with progressive stakeholders within community who might be like-minded, but who can make sure that our concerns are addressed. So that is why you see ourselves affiliating with ZimAlliance, because we knew that we could not be alone and fight this struggle as students to win. We introduced a culture in which for activities like the General Council for Art Tours, we would be there to attend and offer our solidarity message. ZCTU, the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Union, we would go there and offer our voice. But this culture, I see it more as a legacy, because solidarity is not only the language of the oppressed, but it gives us a resting peace, especially when you are at the receiving end of oppression. During those moments, you used to go through unjust arrests, torture, abductions. You needed a platform with people who could tell you that this can happen, but you need to continuously fight. So having that as a culture, I see it more also as a legacy that would come through. But I think lastly, it would be around realizing the power of institutionalizing our work as students. And I think we managed to have a functional secretariat, is the Zimbabwe National Students Union, which was also supported by ZimAlliance. But importantly, it was to make sure that within their roles professionally, they needed to speak through to how we can have a students' movement as a vehicle that from the communication end speaks well with, or unpacks well the vision and narrative that we believe in as a Zimbabwe National Students Movement. From an administrative function, we curate the programs that we believe are in line with the students' movement that can appeal and communicate with barometers of class consciousness. That we also look more around evaluating our work. So I see that as a legacy because students' movements, they exist in such a way that they respond to what is happening then, but fail to look back to realize the importance or the nitty-gritties of what that the work they were doing, how can it be improved. So having some monitoring and evaluation, processes within that aspect, I see it more as a win at a legacy scale because it allowed us to look at, what the shortfalls, how we could do something more, the signature programs, how when we have managed to do one program successfully, we can do it even bigger on the next step. So that responds more to the staircase that I believe as a leader, I was only meant to take one step and leave the baton to the next.
I think that's a good segue for us to then go to bigger things. We are now the member of parliament. Bigger things now, member of parliament. How does it happen, and how do you link it back to all this foundation that you've been talking about?
Thank you. I think the foundation that I've talked about responds to the academic side of me, the professional side of myself, but importantly, the advocacy side of me, to which I posit that the duty and role of a policymaker in Zimbabwe has been defined according to the Constitution, particularly Section 119, to be in line with three things. That is, number one, the representative function, number two, the oversight function, and lastly, the legislative function. To execute both, there is a certain form and that is required and demanded. And that is for you to understand contextually, intellectually, how the world functions, but importantly, how you engage with society, because there is a feedback loop and also how you tap into the demands and support of society that you also need to master. So this journey of me being with the ZimAlliance and Trust Africa also molded me to become that same individual who can write those documents, who can speak to the legislative agenda, who can engage with the masses, particularly because I've been used to be with the Citizens Manifesto, and now I can still know the grievances that people have, or even their supports. So it allows you to realize the power of the people, but not to distance yourself and be divorced from all that they are facing. ZimAlliance, I submit that it was, a blast furnace that refined my leadership in a form and way that as a member of parliament now, I can engage with the masses of our people. I can speak through my agendas clearly. When I was in at the Summit of the Future and also beyond that with the McCain Institute, I was outlining the 5 Ps agenda that I had in just evaluating my work as a member of parliament. That was in line with, number one, promoting sustainable youth inclusion. Number two, pushing for a more pragmatic education sector, which is anchored on skills development. Number three, preserving progressive laws and repealing those that are retrogressive. So this is to mean that when I'm in parliament, I need to be pro the disability bill that is coming through. I need to be pro the national youth bill that has been promised by the president for years and years and not been tabled in parliament. I need to be against the PVO bill, which is stifling the civil society and the work that they do. I need to be against, many bills that are against that. But also importantly, to promote empowerment and employment. But lastly, is the last P, to pioneer a fight against drug and substance abuse. So that being my 5 Ps agenda. I understand that I managed to know that attaining power is different from attaining responsibility. And understanding my duty as a leader and how I need to redefine leadership as a way of assuming that same responsibility is to understand what I'm going to do, how I'm going to do, and who is going to help me do what I need to do. And importantly, how I need to then evaluate all that I've done in segments. Since this is a 5-year term of office as a member of parliament, each year you need to look back, even in a world in which there is mistrust in institutional politics, where parliament has been seen with other views as a vehicle for, self-gain, self-aggrandizement, and you name it. I still need to register that as young people, we should be part of these key institutions which are within the black box of democratic governance, as institutions in which we can still participate in decision-making processes, in the lawmaking of our country, and be a voice in the end of the day of the people. And that is just in line with democratic governance, with equitable development, and importantly, African philanthropy that Trust Africa has been pushing through. But importantly, the work that ZimAlliance has been doing to, empower a constituency to respond to its needs and desires.
Yeah. So I think we have kind of covered what I wanted to ask, but what I wanted to really get to is you continue to be associated in one form or the other with ZimAlliance.
Yes.
And maybe some of the work that you did there. And I wanted to say, what are the things that you actually can link back to ZimAlliance right now that you are responsible for in Parliament, but also in your current position as the chair of the Youth Caucus?
Yes. So I think I've mentioned that the duty of a parliamentarian within the three facets of being, playing the representative role, the oversight, and the legislative role. But importantly, you now need to look at ZimAlliance as a constituency in which they can influence my work as a policymaker. So that is at a level of making policies that are responding to the needs and wants of the students who are part of ZimAlliance, of the vendors who are part of ZimAlliance, the teachers who are part of ZimAlliance. So in other words, I still remain a voice, but using a different institution now to execute my roles and functions. And I think there might be challenges and opportunities in doing that, but importantly, I still need to stick more, and I stick more with ZimAlliance because it's where I get the genuine and concrete issues and bring them forth to Parliament. It's where I can get how people respond to the variety of bills. Particularly, I mentioned the PVO bill. There were papers that were being registered through around the responses towards the PVO bill that were coming through from the ZimAlliance side. And this would help my submissions in Parliament to say this is what the people are saying, and this is what the people want to see. So I think to respond to that question that you have raised, I'm just but in another vehicle and institution, but the institution ZimAlliance provides for a platform where I can tap into all the issues that they're saying, all the voices, the concerns that they are registering, but still coming with them back to the House, to the National Assembly. But importantly, as a member and leader of the Youth Caucus, which is a vehicle in which we are trying to curb political animosity. You know how polarized our society is, but the Youth Caucus allows us to remove political jackets and say what are the genuine youth issues or grievances that we should, regardless of you being from the Triple C or ZANU-PF, we need to be furthering and be pushing. So I understand that the ZimAlliance also has a youth voice and a youth concern that it needs to see being handled or to see being materialized. And being part of the Youth Caucus gives now the ZimAlliance a platform in which we can have those meetings, invite them to engagements, speak through their concerns, register through their issues that they want to see happening, and deal with the hurdles that stop Parliament from executing its main mandate because of the level of zealotry and the level of how people end up focusing on themselves and disengaging from the collective needs of the people. So I think that is more of what links the synergy between the work I do now and ZimAlliance as a platform that responds to the voices of people and creates a constituency of civil society that seeks to transform society positively to respond to what it really wants
Yeah.
to
So,
see.
so my last question, and then we can ask Tender as well. Then we can close. Is do you think so let me back up a bit. So ZimAlliance is probably seen as a project of Trust Africa and supported by several partners. But do you think the broader civil society in Zimbabwe realizes this strategic link that you were describing between ZimAlliance and the possibility of influencing policy, this and that? Do you think the broader civil society sees that strategic alliance with you as an MP and others who are probably in parliament? And then the last part would be also in all of this, I've kept on referring to donors, to development partners. What would be your reflection on how development partners should engage, maybe drawing lessons from what you have experienced with ZimAlliance? So let's start with the broader civil society, realizing or not realizing the strategic importance of having people like you and others in parliament.
Yeah, so I think whether they do realize or not, which I think the level of engagement between civil society and policymakers is breathtakingly low. My submission would be anchored around how you can engage in sessions, engage in committee meetings with no voice, particularly from major players in civil society. But I think uh, this can also be attributed to a number of factors which I would not want to fully blame on the civil society. It might also be the behavior that we exhibit as policymakers once we attain power, and it becomes something that we love for us to disengage from civil society. So there's no blame that should go to either or of the forces, but it's just an emphasis of how that synergy is so important, and we should strive, no matter how hard, each and every 5 year cycle, there should be an engagement of policymakers to say these are our issues as maybe SimCord, as Trust Africa, ZimAlliance. Where can we influence policy and what can you help us with? Equip the particular members of parliament who are coming through with the information that they need. Sometimes what leads to our downfall is policymakers is the information gap that we end up being, perpetrators of, or maybe victims of it. Why? Because you are in a committee meeting and you don't have particular statistics that inform how people are being affected. So it simply means that at the level of prioritizing some other policy agendas, the particular issue that you are raising becomes or is taken less seriously. So essentially, we need to see civil society as a tool to equip policymakers and lawmakers to say this is how recession evidence, this is what it is saying, and this is what the advocacy scale, this is how we think we can influence it. So we need to be seeing more of petitions. Each and every sitting of parliament, there should be petitions that are coming through from the teachers. There are petitions that teachers need wages. They need an increase in, good working conditions. And I believe that is more, what we need to look at a level of just equipping policymakers. Then going to the last part of your question around my view with how other development partners, which I would want to call them more around, not donors, uh, should influence the work that's being done, particularly looking from the policy making, but also, like you mentioned, from the ZimAlliance side of things. I think to begin with, it is to invest in understanding contexts before issuing out that support. it should be more around knowing what are the major issues that people are being affected with and how you can then penetrate to play a role. Maybe sometimes it's to catalyze change. Maybe sometimes it's to introduce it as an idea. Sometimes it is to engage with change. And sometimes it is to redefine it. Because we are in a permanent state of change. Because people like, Karl Marx would say that society each day, is evolving. And once society evolves, we always need to conceptualize our issues to say what is the big idea. The big idea globally is around climate change, technological transformations, the global finance system, trade and investment. But the big idea contextually in an underdeveloped third world country is much more divorced from that. Sometimes it's around how people can fail to engage in meaningful advocacy because of poverty. Sometimes it's around how institutions have managed to tactfully and intentionally divorce themselves from the genuine voice of the people. So you realize that government should be the one with the mandate to deliver, and they have distanced themselves from it. But the end, we, as the middle class is there to enable that at times. But importantly, I think development partners can look at their programming and what they're going to focus on and say, these are the 5 issues contextually that we need to invest in. And regardless of how there might be, these policies that seek to silence dissent, that seek to silence even the support systems that are being provided through by development partners, I also submit that they need to relook into how they can still support, societies like our own country or even any other country out there. This is because without that particular support, the people will completely kneel down to the authoritarian nature of our countries. So we need to make sure that there is still a way that they support with information, with resource, um, with even just providing support at uh, African philanthropy. People how they can be assisted for them to meaningfully engage in society. Lastly, it would be for the development partners to redefine um, donor support or resource support. Let them not think that providing money is the only support that can be issued. Sometimes in other areas, issuing out or giving out books can be a critical resource. Sometimes making people realize their own power is a resource, like what the ZimAlliance and Citizen Manifesto Project has been doing, to say, regardless of you not having money, but you can still console yourselves and find power in humanity. I think those are critical aspects in which the development partners also need to look into. A research intellectually to redefine that resource does not only come in the monetary form. It goes beyond that. It goes to many things that you can think of. And for us to equip a citizen to fully embrace society and participate as a responsible citizen, those are things that they should, be in the know of, but also offer and attain that particular support.
Yeah. So anything from you, Tendai?
Just a quick one, and I think this is the last question. What could ZimAlliance do differently?
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of what ZimAlliance can do differently, for me, it would be around 2 things. The first thing would be, um, while there have been these signature programs, particularly to mention the National Citizens Convention, the Let Art Speak narrative, I think ZimAlliance can have a more closer relationship with other organizations that are yet to come. We are saying ZimAlliance is providing for a platform for institutions that are already there. But to respond to your questions, when society is evolving, there are new institutions that are supposed to come. ZimAlliance should look at how it can support those particular institutions that are mushrooming or maybe, germinating because of how society is evolving. Major institutions have been given birth during moments of crisis. And we don't only have an economic crisis in Zimbabwe that can lead to an organization like SimCode to say we need to come through and respond to how debt and development is linked. We need to come through with maybe another new organization that responds to, that covers the gap between constitutional literacy. So I think there is an investment that ZimAlliance should do, regardless of all these signature programs, to say what's the new institution that's coming up that needs support. In that institution, when it comes to ZimAlliance, it should just be seen as that institution that is being there. So maybe it is to provide for, I think, the hub or maybe an incubation of those small institutions, see where they can go, give support to those small ideas, see how they can contribute to where we are going. Because it's no longer now more about the small institutions, it's now about the big ideas. So those big ideas can come through with small institutions because of the nature of how they have not, revisited themselves systematically to become big. But I think that can be another area in which ZimAlliance can, advance its work to support those small-minded, not small-minded, those, small entities, small institutions, but also just upcoming institutions, give them support and promote them. Then lastly, I think for ZimAlliance to continuously strengthen the relationship between the ZimAlliance programming, but also other international voices. That is so important because that is when platforms like ZimAlliance realize that the problems that we're fighting are not only Zim-based. Sometimes they are, from an African perspective, issues that are being held in South Africa. But one would say that we will be moving from the ZimAlliance because we want to focus more locally. And I would respond to them that the only way we can strengthen the local voice is by also learning through what others have gone through in other areas. So it's an investment to say what has been done in other countries. Some of these issues that we are facing, particularly with the ZimAlliance program, at a level of opportunities or challenges, maybe these are things that have been faced through by people who are in Nigeria, and we need to send people there, part of the ZimAlliance, who go and understand that this is how we prevailed in such a situation. So it's more around strengthening that relationship and bond with how other societies have progressed, but also retrogressed. So we learn through their failures, but we also take through their success stories and copy from what they've done. Thank you.
Honorable Takudzwa Godfrey Ngadziore, we could go on and on and on, but thank you so much for giving us your time, your insights,
Yes.
but most importantly, your reflections as one of the people who has been associated with the initiative from the beginning,
Yes.
all the way to now where you are sitting at an apex level, dealing with issues of policy making, representation, among others. Yes. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode.
Thank you.
That was Honorable Godfrey Takudzwa Ngadziore joining us on this special segment of our conversations on African philanthropy, focusing on the history, the emergence, and the evolution of the ZimAlliance project, which is a project implemented within Trust Africa, focusing on strengthening civil society formations in the democratic building and economic empowerment spaces in Zimbabwe. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.